Hey, what's up? It's your girl Neek, and you're tuned in to Neek at Night. And tonight we're going to be talking about this lawsuit that Don Richard of Danity Kane filed against Diddy. And I'm going to go over it with you guys in this stream. Now, I did a full breakdown of this lawsuit, and it was 2 hours, 41 minutes of me going through all the pages. In his recent indictment, there was mention of kidnapping and allegations of him kidnapping people. And a lot of people were wondering, where did some of those kidnapping allegations come from? And a lot of people were referring to Cassie. However, in Don's lawsuit, there was a part in her lawsuit where she talked about how he false imprisoned her, and we're gonna get into that specific detail in this video right after I refresh your memory on what the prosecutor said, and then we're gonna see what she had to say about her experience.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Damian Williams, and I'm the U.S. Attorney here in the Southern District of New York. Today, I'm announcing the unsealing of a 3-count indictment, charging Sean Combs with racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking, interstate transportation for prostitution. The indictment alleges that between at least 2008 and the present, Combs abused, threatened, and coerced victims to fulfill his sexual desires, protect his reputation, and conceal his conduct. As alleged in the indictment, to carry out this conduct, Sean Combs led and participated in a racketeering conspiracy that used the business empire he controlled to carry out criminal activity, including sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and the obstruction of justice.
Okay, so you heard what his attorney said. He said forced labor, kidnapping, trafficking, and some more. And Don details some of those things in her lawsuit.
Forced labor, kidnapping, bribery, and the obstruction of justice.
All right, so let me highlight those parts that she mentioned it in her lawsuit, and then we'll be out. In or around the fall of 2009, Diddy Dirty Money began recording the song Love Comes Down. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs continued to use drugs that caused him to remain awake for prolonged periods of time. When he was awake, he would demand that Miss Richard and Miss Harper record in the studio, where they would spend 3 to 4 consecutive days recording without a break to eat or sleep. Mr. Combs required Miss Richard and Miss Harper to remain at his homes, continuously denying the opportunity to return to their hotel rooms for breaks. The degree of control Mr. Combs exercised over Miss Richard's daily life and basic needs exacerbated the significant power imbalance and threatening atmosphere that ensured Miss Richards' compliance with his demands. Combs regularly left the studio and required Miss Richard and Miss Harper to stay and write verses to songs. Occasionally, Miss Richards tried to leave to get something to eat or to go to her hotel. Whenever Miss Richard tried to leave, Mr. Combs would call and demand, "Where the F are you? We have an album to make." Mr. Combs frequently made threats, especially if they asked for food or rest, stating, "You're a B. I don't want to see your effing face. I make ends go missing and I make things go away." Each time Miss Richard returned to the studio, immediately believing that Mr. Combs was capable of the following through with his threats, Mr. Combs criticized Miss Richards for being too skinny, yet denied her request for food and demanded that she drink only peanut butter shakes. Mr. Combs had full meals prepared by a chef and ate them in front of Miss Richard and Miss Harper, never offering them food. Child, you better than me, girl. You is better than me, honey. Miss Richard and Miss Harper begged for food and rest breaks, but Mr. Combs refused, making statements such as, "Absolutely effing not," and "This is what it takes to be great." Mr. Combs' responses underscored the threat that he posed and heightened Miss Richards' concern for her safety and well-being. As Miss Richard continued to work nonstop, transitioning between the studio, rehearsals, workouts, and back to the studio, she became severely dehydrated and experienced chronic stomach cramping from being undernourished and excessively thin. On the numerous occasions that she told Mr. Combs that she was not feeling well, he called her lazy and diminished her health concerns, instilling in her further apprehension of communicating her needs. In or around the summer of 2010, Miss Richard experienced abdominal pain, swollen glands, and a fever. She was hospitalized and diagnosed with arthralgia, joint pain due to overuse, sprains, and tendinitis and infection, anemia, and a low white blood cell count. Miss Richard presented Mr. Combs with her medical records specifying that she needed to emphasize eating well, being adequately hydrated, and getting adequate rest. But Mr. Combs ordered her to report to the studio the next day for another multi-day recording session. Mr. Combs' blatant disregard for her health and well-being cemented Miss Richards' fear of his authority and control over her career and health. Miss Richard continued to witness Mr. Combs' use towards Cassie. Cassie often wore sunglasses and makeup in attempt to hide visible injuries. These incidents further solidified Miss Richards' fear of Mr. Combs, as they were constant reminders of the physical dangers she potentially could and eventually would face. Mr. Combs often exhibited uncontrollable anger during recording sessions, throwing objects like albums, laptops, and food against the wall or at individuals. Mr. Combs frequently flew into frenzied, unpredictable rages. Miss Richard feared making any misstep that could direct his anger towards her. However, her fears went beyond her immediate physical safety. Because she had witnessed Mr. Combs' violent nature, a side of Mr. Combs that the world had not yet seen, she feared that falling out of Mr. Combs' good graces, or worse, standing up to him or speaking out against him, could result in serious harm to her. Miss Richard frequently thought about Mr. Combs' threat about making people go missing and feared taking any action that could label her as a target. Mr. Combs and falsely imprisons Miss Richards. In or around December 2010, Diddy Dirty Money was preparing for an upcoming performance on Saturday Night Live. As usual, rehearsals lasted for days without the opportunity to eat or rest, and the rehearsal schedule was unpredictable. After waiting all day for Mr. Combs to call or send a car, Miss Richard received a phone call from Mr. Combs demanding, "Where the F are you bees? You bees don't want this. Y'all don't deserve to have someone pick you up. Get a cab." Miss Richard and Miss Harper immediately took a taxi to Sir Studios in New York. Anxious because Mr. Combs sounded enraged. Upon their arrival at Sir Studios, Mr. Combs and Harve Pierre were waiting for them in the lobby. Mr. Combs screamed obscenities at them. "Where the F were you bees? You bees don't want to win. You don't want this. I'm so tired of y'all." Miss Richard noticed that people in the lobby were reacting to Mr. Combs' tirade. Embarrassed, Miss Richard asked Mr. Combs to stop swearing and calling them bees in front of everyone. Mr. Combs' facial expressions shifted as he stepped towards Miss Richard, raised his arm, and swung his fist towards her face. Believing that Mr. Combs was going to hit her, Miss Richard braced for the impact. Before Mr. Combs could strike her, Mr. Combs' bodyguard grabbed her, escorted her out of the studio, and forced her into the Bad Boy Records Bentley that was parked outside. Miss Harper ran after Miss Richard, and Mr. Combs' bodyguard closed and locked the Bentley doors with both women inside. You can't. If a Bentley door is it's a meat mallet. It's a flat it's a flat side and then it's a rigid side. I don't use the rigid side, I use the flat side. But anyways, so inside a Bentley, oh, maybe the child safety lock on all doors? How they didn't get out? How they couldn't get out? Anyway, crazy. So, let's see. It says they was locked inside a Bentley. Okay, so inside the vehicle, Miss Richard realized there were no interior door handles. Oh, I guess I should have kept reading. Inside the vehicle, Miss Richard realized there were no interior door handles and that they were locked inside with no way to escape. Miss Richards' belongings were in the studio, but she was able to call her father from Miss Harper's cell phone. Miss Richard relayed to her father what had happened and that she needed help and feared that she would go missing. Moments later, Mr. Combs' bodyguard removed only Miss Harper from the Bentley, leaving Miss Richard locked inside the car alone for 2 hours. Miss Richard screamed as loudly as she could, but no one responded. It was late evening in the wintertime. The windows were heavily tinted, and the interior of the car was dark except for faint interior lights. Miss Richards' belongings and winter coat were in the studio while the ignition was off and there was no heat. Mr. Combs' prior threats and lengths running through her mind, Miss Richard felt sheer panic, terror, and feelings of claustrophobia at being locked in a small, dark, enclosed space with no way to communicate or call for help. She began to feel cold and feared for her life, not knowing when or if she would be released. Miss Richards' father drove to New York from Baltimore and arrived at the studio approximately 2 hours later. Only after her father arrived and demanded to see her did Mr. Pierre order Mr. Combs' bodyguard to release Miss Richard from the vehicle. Mr. Pierre ushered Miss Richards' father between several rooms at Sir Studios, where he waited for approximately 2 hours before being able to confront Mr. Combs. Once Miss Richards' father expressed that he intended to contact the police, Mr. Combs warned him to think about your family and think about your daughter's career. Her father appeared visibly frightened by Mr. Combs' threats and actions, which in turn made Miss Richard feel terrified for herself and her family's safety. The next night, Diddy Dirty Money performed on SNL. What? The next night? What? Girl, I know you lying. The next night. That's nuts. You called your daddy? Your daddy came to rescue you? Then he bowed down? And then I just don't want a career that bad. Like, that's nuts. Anyways, so it says the next night, Diddy Dirty Money performed on SNL. Mr. Combs subsequently called Miss Richard, complimented her performance, and concluded with a threat. You don't call your dad unless you're in the hospital. He called her phone and said, you don't call your dad unless you in the hospital. Whew.